Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today we're welcoming Reverend Teresa Hord Owens to the show. Reverend Hord Owens is the General Minister and President of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada. She is the first person of color and second woman to lead the denomination, and the first woman of African descent to lead a mainline denomination. Elected in 2017, Reverend Hord Owens was re-elected to a second term as General Minister and President in 2023. Her ministry actively reflects the disciples' priority of being an anti-racist church, being a movement for wholeness, welcoming all to the Lord's table as God has welcomed us. Her exhortation to the church is, let's be the church we say we are. It is in being who we say we are that we actively bear witness to God's limitless love for all. Reverend Hord Owens earned her bachelor's degree from Harvard University and her MDiv from the University of Chicago Divinity School, where she subsequently served as Dean of Students for 12 years. Reverend Hord Owens' resume includes more than 20 years of leadership in corporate America, leading diverse teams in data management. She serves on the National Council of Churches as the treasurer of the governing board and is a member of the World Council of Churches Central Committee. Let's welcome Reverend Hord Owens to the show. All right, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Lauren Richmond Jr., and I'm pleased to be welcoming today General Minister and President of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, Reverend Teresa Hord Owens. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you, Lauren, for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, looking forward to it as well. So, anything else you'd like to share about yourself with our listeners?
Well, the most exciting thing that's happening in my life is I'm a relatively new grandma. I have an 18-month-old grandson who lives here in the Chicago area with me. I get to spend time with him. So he sort of rearranged my priorities for what I do with my free time and a different perspective on the world. I'm also a very musical person. I'm married to a musician and gave birth to one. So our family is really into theater and all kinds of classical hip hop. My son produces K-pop. So
wow.
Gifted with a beautiful family.
Yeah. And I'll say as a parent, we appreciate grandparents' involvement.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. Well, share, if you would, kind of your faith journey, what that's looked like in the past and what that looks like today.
I grew up in a progressive Baptist church where my grandfather was the minister, small town in southern Indiana. Indiana at the time, and still is, some would argue, it's beyond a red state. For many years in the early 20th century, Indiana was sort of, the Republican Party in Indiana was the Klan. My grandfather was active in helping to desegregate public facilities, worked very closely, led the NAACP in our town, got several threats and death threats as a result of that work. So for me, I was baptized at an early age, like 5 years old, at Vacation Bible School, and Papa was the minister. So what he said had great credibility. And so I always saw the model of church as being faith in community. Our church was the, ground zero for a lot of community work. My grandfather helped to build a new community center that still stands, the Charles T. Height Community Center.
Wow.
So the kinds of things that I saw, faith in action, along with Sunday school and Baptist Training Union and Vacation Bible School, I saw the church very active in the community, really vibrant ministry to college students, Indiana State, Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology, St. Mary of the Woods College. So it was a very vibrant and well-rounded ministry. And my other set of grandparents belonged to another Baptist church out in what we call the country, a small church that had been founded in 1850 by community of blacks who came to that part of the state in 1820.
Wow.
And so I'm descended from a really historic African-American community in Indiana, and always knew about those roots from my grandparents. So one grandfather's a minister, the other's a deacon in the other church, very active. And so church was a big part of my life, but it was also about community and justice from a very early age.
Yeah. So if I heard you right, then you're kind of a preacher's kid, yes, technically?
Yeah, PGK, preacher's grandkid. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yes. Okay, great. And then share, if you would, kind of your journey into the Christian Church Disciple of Christ and how that led to where you're at right now.
Yes, my mother moved to Indianapolis when I was in college. My parents had divorced. And my mother did a unique thing. She invited her 3 college-age kids to look for a church together. We had friends who were members of the Second Christian Church, as it was known now, Light of the World Christian Church. But my grandfather had been a state leader in the Baptist church. And so we literally, I think, visited probably every Black Baptist church in Indianapolis and kept coming back to Second Christian, Dr. T. Garrett Benjamin Jr. And we finally made the decision as a family, my mom and her 3 college-age kids, the decision to join that church, not really realizing at the time what it meant for this church to be connected with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. But in my college years, being home during the summers, when I graduated from college, I came back to Indiana and served that church on the music staff part-time, playing and working with the youth choir. My career led me away to Chicago, and I actually joined another church, an AME Zion church, met and married my husband, who was recruited back to my home disciples church to be the minister of music. And from that point, I discerned a call to ministry at my home church, and we were there for about 9 years. And eventually, once I discerned that call, wanted to go to the University of Chicago. We have Disciples Divinity House, affiliated with the Divinity School there, a really strong disciples community. And so that brought us back to Chicago, and we've been here ever since. But I was an IT consultant, IT executive. I was recruited away from my corporate career, which I was always working. I was working full-time and going to school full-time. It was a crazy 4 years, actually, with a 9-year-old who, my son and my husband, serving a large church in ministry. He took a job with the church so that we could come back. And I served the University of Chicago Divinity School for 12 years as dean of students. And while I was doing that, pastored a small congregation in the western suburbs of Chicago, First Christian Church in Downers Grove. So that's the work I was doing, very fulfilled. And I say that I was drafted. People, when it was time for Sharon Watkins to end her term, my predecessor, people said, have you ever thought about being considered for general minister and president? And I quite honestly had not. And there were so many people that kept asking me this, and I allowed people to put my name into nomination for the process. And quite honestly was not that stressed out about it, because I was very happy and content being the dean of students at the Divinity School and serving the congregation. There are parts of both of those things that I really miss. But you laugh and say you have a plan and God has another plan. And so I just began the process and said, if it is for me, it will be, and we'll see what happens. So here I am, and just reelected to my second term last summer at our General Assembly.
Yeah, and I was fortunate to be a part of that election. I think it was pretty safe bet you were going to get there, but I'm glad to support you. Share, if you would, some things that sustain you spiritually, especially as you have this big role of leading so many pastors and so many people.
Absolutely. I think one of the most important things, and I've said this from the beginning when I was the nominee, and I continue to say it everywhere I go, is that we are followers of Jesus Christ. And so there's a spiritual person, Paul calls it the inner man, that has to be fed and nurtured. And I firmly believe in prayer, meditation, spiritual practice, I practice centering prayer, which is, simply being quiet and allowing God to speak. I lead an intercessory prayer time whenever I can on Facebook Live on Wednesdays. I started that during the pandemic and have continued to do it, even though I'm traveling more. I can't do it every week, but I continue to do it because I enjoy inviting people into that sacred space where I reflect a little on scripture, whatever the lectionary texts are. I do just a brief commentary on this text. And then I pray for whatever people want prayer for. I ask them to, let's celebrate, let's thank God. What are the, what are the praise reports? But my own practice, now that I'm not pastoring and preaching every week, I preach quite a bit on the weekends. But when I'm not, because I'm not pastoring, I study the lectionary every week. And that's become my Bible study, sort of my guide through the Bible. I have lots of different devotional texts that I read. I'm always walking alongside our denominational Advent and Lenten devotionals. I read a lot of Howard Thurman. So I really believe you have to study. Fred Craddock, one of our illustrious preachers, said, the life of ministry is a life of study.
Yeah.
And so we can't really grapple or wrestle with the text that God knows that it's a hard text sometimes to deal with and to preach and to teach, but you have to kind of stay with it. And that feeds me. And I spend time in prayer and meditation and try to find quiet time for myself. I travel a lot. So sometimes time on the plane becomes that, that quiet time where I just put earbuds in and just am quiet and alone to myself. So.
Yeah. Closer to God, we might say, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's really important. And I find that when I don't do those things regularly, I can feel a difference in myself. And I think it's important for those of us who serve, particularly who are faith leaders, spiritual leaders, that if we're dry, you can, Psalm 1 says that the one who meditates in the word of the Lord day and night will be like a tree planted by the rivers of water. His you'll give fruit in due season, and the leaves won't wither.
Yeah.
Well, if you're spiritually dry, if you've ever touched a flower or a flower arrangement that's brittle, it can cut you and hurt you.
Right.
So if you are spiritually dry, I think as a spiritual leader, you will either damage yourself, or worse yet, you can damage people when you're not in a good place emotionally and spiritually. So,
boy, good lesson there.
Things, good
lesson there. Yeah, thank you. Well, I appreciate you sharing all that. So for our listeners, I had Terri on to talk about her role leading our denomination, shared denomination, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. We're going to kind of center some of our conversation based on her presentation at the State of the Church as she led the general board and ministry here. Well, that was in April, if I remember correctly.
In April, correct.
Yeah. So let's begin just kind of talking about some of this is going to be a little inside baseball here for listeners who are our ecumenical listeners, so to speak. But share, if you would, kind of what's happening around the denomination with the Covenant Project, the Narrative Project, the Proclamation Project, those sorts of things.
Sure. The Covenant Project represents a huge vote that the General Assembly took last summer to change two things: the way our general board is, how it's comprised and how it's selected, and then the cycle and method by gathering our General Assembly. We're, I think, the only mainline denomination that actually has a governance process that allows every single congregation to have voting delegates to make choices. So the General Assembly for us is like the top body.
Yeah.
That's the body that elects me and we, our moderators, and there's many decisions that could be made by the general board, but ultimately have to go to the General Assembly because that's the people. Those are the congregations. You can attend a General Assembly meeting. And again, we have to stress that the General Assembly is actually the body. It's the church. Our church's legal name is the General Assembly of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada. But we have to, in a world where people are less able to afford to attend in-person only meetings, right?
Right.
What it has meant over time is that the participation in those key decision-making gatherings is going down. I remember when there were 9,000 people at General Assembly. And the last two, we've had a little over 3,000. And so that means that the people who are really making the decisions, and each congregation right now gets 2 voting delegates, and anyone can attend. Anyone could actually come to the mic and have voice, but there are only a few people from each of those congregations that are allowed to vote. We've changed, so with the goal of this connection and getting more people involved in this very unique, my counterparts and peers in the ecumenical world say every single congregation gets a representative. It's like, yes, every single congregation. We have a little over 3,000. The new rules would give every congregation 3 voting delegates. So we could potentially have a gathering of 9,000 people.
Yeah.
So we've moved the in-person event from every 2 years to every 3 years. But in between, we're going to start having virtual, digital gatherings at least once a year, not just to have a docket where we vote yay or nay on particular topics, but to develop this understanding of listening. There's like listening, learning, discerning, and deciding, right? So sometimes we have issues that come to the floor of the General Assembly, and we don't even know or understand the issue that's at hand. We had an emergency resolution in Louisville in July that just simply wanted to oppose the anti-trans legislation that was causing so much devastation to young people and their families, and taking away the rights of parents to decide how they would care for their kids and their kids' own process. Some people don't even know what the word transgender means or what that actually means, and they're confused. So if you bring something to the floor, and we haven't had a chance to do education or discussion about it, we create these sort of false divisions that are simply there because we haven't moved to the place where people understand well enough to authentically disagree.
Right.
And we also have a situation where if you feel that the position that's being taken, no one's going to hear you, oh, the church is always going to vote along these lines, I can't speak. That's not a situation that we want either.
Yeah.
So hopefully within these virtual meetings, and the virtual meetings are not being construed as everybody in a Zoom box, right? And we've got thousands of people on a Zoom screen.
Yeah.
We're thinking more communal gatherings.
Yeah.
Like we might have churches that have the ability to connect, good Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is weak in certain parts of the country. But maybe there's a church that has space, almost like a mini regional assembly, where people could come and gather. They could be sort of a satellite hub and connect both the visual and the ability to come to the mic and conduct this sort of church-wide virtual meeting where the voting representatives still have the ability to vote. We're looking at technology that will allow us to vote remotely. But even people in the congregations who are not voting representatives would still be able to participate, hear what's happening, contribute, speak, and have a greater sense of being connected to this wider church. So those are the changes that will be happening with the General Assembly. With the General Board, currently, each regional ministry, that's 31 regions, and each general ministry, 13 of those, sends a representative, and that leaves us with 17 at large. Well, just because each one sends one doesn't necessarily mean that the whole is as diverse as we want it to be.
Sure.
And right now, those terms are like 2 years. So every 2 years, you've got a new group of people.
Right.
Just as they're figuring it out.
Yep.
You have to continually educate people about the trajectory of where the church is going. We also don't necessarily get the kinds of skills that you would want on any board. Financial, organizational development, teachers, educators, attorneys, as well as clergy. We always have try to have a good balance between clergy and laity so that our laity are in good numbers, so that the general board is not dominated by clergy, but there's an equal proportion of laity. So instead of each one sending one, people will now nominate, and the general nominating committee will choose 50 voting representatives. Smaller board, working board that will be participating with these virtual gatherings every year with the General Assembly. We'll have the ability for the moderator to call the General Assembly into session digitally. So that's the Covenant Project, really trying to get people more plugged in to the decision-making and discerning process of various issues that are part of the church, and making it possible for people to participate so that the economics of being there in person for travel is not a barrier.
Yeah.
And even when we do gather in person, creating a hybrid option so that you can participate in all the business remotely. So that, and we're calling it Covenant Project. Number one, because when you say governance, people's eyes roll backwards
Right.
in their heads. But because we're a covenantal body,
Yeah.
we don't have a hierarchical structure. I don't have a big gavel where I can just say, so let it be written, so let it be done, right? So our churches are really the foundation, and they're really the highest pillar of decision making that we have. So we have to be sure that our congregations can participate, because one of the things that we learned in this whole process is too many of our congregations, they don't know how the general board works. They don't know what happens at General Assembly. And they are the crux of all of that. And so connection is really there. So this covenant, we had created a curriculum, a 6-week video curriculum with a study guide to really reinforce what does it mean to be a church that lives in covenant. So let me jump to the Church Narrative Project. Church Narrative Project, kind of, and I'm always trying to connect the dots between these three.
Mm-hmm.
I started out setting a personal goal to say, we're a church that's anti-racist, pro-reconciling.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been doing this for decades, right? We've been training for decades. And it feels like the training has only gotten to the clergy level.
Right.
It hasn't really made it into the pews. How do we better live into that? And consulted with Dr. David Anderson Hooker, who I had met at a National Council of Churches event, and thought, well, maybe he could help us sort of assess reconciliation ministry. What he taught me was that unless we change the narrative that we're all living into, training won't matter.
Yeah.
He calls the narrative the highway, and the stories are our cars. So we could let a whole lot of cars onto the highway.
Right.
But if the direction in which they could move doesn't change, then we're not changing anything really. And I often say that the unspoken narrative of our church is that we're really a predominantly white denomination that has decided it wants to let some other people come to the table. So as long as we're still acting and living like that, nothing will really change.
Mm-hmm.
You can even have a black GMP, for heaven's sakes.
Mm-hmm.
And if everything else that you understand about who we are and where the real power is and where the real opportunities are, if that doesn't change, then nothing has really changed.
Yeah.
So the Church Narrative Project is region by region. We're having conversations, allowing people to sort of name what's the problematic, because people aren't the problem. The problem is the problem. Let's name the problem. We all probably have people that if we could move them out of the way, our lives would be simpler. But it's not that simple. The problem is the problem. And so region by region, Dr. Anderson spends time with them, and we sort of map it out.
Mm-hmm.
And then we talk about, in the midst of all of that, what are the things that you really want the Christian Church Disciples of Christ to be and speak to? What do you want people to feel and experience as part of this church? So we've done 12 regions, and we're starting to kind of compare notes. And the hope is that we'll build this common narrative that we all say, this is what we want to live into.
Yeah.
This is the narrative that we want to guide who we are. We have a wonderful identity statement that says we are disciples of Christ, a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. As part of the one body of Christ, we welcome all to the table as God has welcomed us. But the narrative that we live into will really describe what we want people to feel and experience.
Mm-hmm.
No matter where you go in our church, different geographies, different races and ethnicities, different cultures, urban, rural, some places of the U.S. and Canada more diverse and some less.
Right.
No matter how we're different as congregations, there ought to be some common elements that one experiences when you come to our church. And that's what we're trying to get at with the narrative. And really, by having the experience of talking about the hard stuff and naming the problems, that's kind of building capacity for people to participate in this new General Assembly world and General Board world where we want you to come to the mic. We want you to speak. We want more people involved. And finally, the Proclamation Project. We were awarded a Lilly grant as part of their compelling preaching grant project. And So the Reverend Dr. Lee Hall Moses is running that project from the Office of General Minister and President. And the goal is to equip primarily mid-career clergy who, and this became clear to us in the middle of the pandemic. All of a sudden, the joke was everyone's a televangelist now, right? Because everybody's got a broadcast, but there were people, my seminary education would never have imagined that I'd be setting up a camera in my sanctuary and nobody's there and I'm broadcasting. So the way in which you conduct yourself on screen is very different than in live. And at a certain point, you really kind of need to refresh how you approach this craft of teaching. Some of us are no longer the young adults, it's hard to,
right.
And so we're preaching to a different generation. The world has changed. So the goal is to create preaching resources for clergy across the life of the church. Right now, we have 4 separate cohort programs, one that's focusing on storytelling and other types of expression, one that's working on media and technology. We have a couple of groups that are focused on language. So a group of clergy whose first language is Spanish, another group whose first language is Korean, and building these. And so this is the first of a 3-year program. So these are our first cohorts. We have some other, these cohorts will meet in person and some other cohorts that are meeting online. We've had some online preaching seminars featuring people like Leah Shade at Lexington Theological Seminary, who has a great book called Preaching in the Purple Zone. Like, how do we preach and talk in this completely polarized society? We had a New Testament professor, Dr. Stephanie Crowder, who is on the faculty at Chicago Theological Seminary, helping people prepare to preach during Advent. We're going to have a retreat in October in Arizona, where we're bringing in just really good preachers to kind of inspire the preachers, all right? So all of those things. And really, for clergy, that's job one, right? Effectively,
like you said,
proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ. So those are the 3, what we call the big 3 in our office. And they're all connected really to strengthening both spiritual connection and practice, but strengthening the connections that we have across the life of the church and helping us to not be afraid to deal with the hard questions and the hard problems. If the church doesn't deal with it, then who can? So that's my real prayer is not only connection, but building this capacity to deal with the tough things as we decide how we will live as church in a new world.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that building capacity. I hope to talk more about that here in a few moments. Share, if you would, just kind of about Alex, the kind of denominational data gathering tool. I know data is all the rage right now. Some of it, obviously, in mainline world is not super optimistic, but share more with some lessons that can be gleaned from the tool with Alex.
You have to first know that I spent most of my IT career in data warehousing and database management. And my IBM days, my Ernst & Young days, this is the kind of work that I did. And I spent several years at Anthem Blue Cross and Blue Shield as the director of corporate data management and leading that institution. And that was my career, was understanding data and helping organizations to understand data and the power of information. When I came to BGMP, of course, the yearbook is our census. We're a 501c3 organization. We have a group tax exemption. So one of the important things we have to do is have a census, right, of who is affiliated with our church and we have a ministry directory in that, who are the recognized clergy, which allows clergy other tax benefits. And so there might be a few hard copy reports in that book, but the book is, yay thick, a small phone book kind of thing. I'm almost flabbergasted to think about my initial reaction. There were no online reporting tools or capabilities, and people were filling out online PDFs that were then printed out and really formatted just so that you could print a book.
Yeah.
Most of our other, I even approached the Lilly Endowment about funding something like this, and it turns out they didn't consider this to be leading edge or, it's like everybody else. Most of our other mainline peers had such a tool. So we've created what we call Alex, short for Alexander Campbell, one of our the founders of our movements. People actually ask me, so what's the ALEX? What does that stand for?
Yeah, now I love to hear
it's
that.
It's actually not an acronym. It's a nickname for Alexander Campbell. But congregations use ALEX. It's a free web-based tool. They use that to enter in their attendance and giving data and all the other questions they would answer on the yearbook. They can answer via ALEX. In addition, week to week, they can enter weekly giving and weekly attendance, enter information about who their pastor is and other things, other census kind of things, and keep that and update that week to week, or they can just enter it once a year. We now take that data and it moves into a database from which we're now able to do reporting. So we're actually getting ready to work on ALEX 2.0 and change the interface a little bit. But at this last general board, we were able to do some nice infographics, some posters on easels to share with folks. One of the interesting phenomena that I always sort of thought and understood, even from a back of the envelope kind of calculation, is that we have about 3,000, a little over 3,000 congregations. Only about half of them even report to the yearbook. In 2023, 1,776, that's an easy number for me to remember. 1,776 actually reported to the yearbook. Of those, only about 60% actually give to our unified giving system, Disciples Mission Fund, or any of our other special offerings. Another thing that we've learned is some of our congregations were ashamed to report because, we're small. We don't want people to know that we're small.
Yeah.
Well, 67% of our churches worship. They have a larger membership, but they worship about 50% or less. So we're a denomination that has a lot of smaller congregations. That's who we are, and we need to understand who we are as we plan strategies for moving forward. And how we serve those congregations, and really giving congregations hope that it's not just the disciples, as you named.
Right.
It's all of the mainline, even evangelical, non-denominational traditions are seeing a decline. The Pew Foundation has all this interesting data about the nones, right? People who don't claim any kind of religious or spiritual connection. So this is the world that we live in. And since the pandemic, we have people who don't even physically want to come to the building anymore.
Yeah.
They've gotten comfortable watching at home. You don't have to get the kids ready. It's easier to do all these things. So we're really trying to continue to think about even our funding system. If congregations aren't connected enough and they don't know enough what's happening and they're not giving, that's impacting our funding. So how can we get them better connected? How can we improve the communication? And so region by region, we can sort of slice and dice this information. Our regional ministers are really starting to get excited about the ability to examine and do analysis based on the congregations in their region. We're working on being able to identify, say, churches that are African-American, predominantly Hispanic and Asian, a little flag there so that the leaders of those ministries can see those congregations that are affiliated there. Looking at the ministry directory, the information that our regions keep on ministers. How can we better understand who those folks are? What's a good demographic? Like right now, we don't even have good information about age because some people felt, it's a violation of privacy to capture somebody's birth date.
Yeah.
Well, I right now couldn't tell you where the clergy are who are under 40. That's a problem. And so the other conversations that we have to have, once you have a question, you have to decide, am I collecting the data that will allow us to answer the question? And in some cases, we're not yet collecting the data that we need. So it's a constant reiterative loop of saying, okay, now I have this question. Do I have the data? If not, then I go get it. So it's, if I weren't GMP, I'd be the consultant trying to make this happen for you. But it's we've got some really brilliant people working alongside our team. And trying to get to a point where we're starting to publish via PDF some statistical summary information instead of printing a book.
Yeah. And what a wonderful gifting that you bring to the position, having that background. I know it'll be a benefit for clergy and church leaders and also researchers. I remember a summer or two ago, Ryan Burge, who's done a lot in this world, was asking about, hey, where's the data on the disciples?
Yeah.
I know he'll be happy for one. Let's shift gears here a little bit and kind of talk about just as we're recording this, we're in the end of May. Obviously, I'm looking forward to summer and slowing down with my kids, but also in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about the fall and, in the States at least, what's going to be most likely a brutal election season. One of the things that I appreciate about this denomination is that we are a diverse, theologically diverse denomination. I say that we're, theologically wide and deep. So we have a wide theological diversity. We also have some, we're a purple denomination in that way too, politically. Talk to leaders now, if you would, just about how you'd encourage them to speak to their congregations during this upcoming season. I'm thinking especially about the importance of table in our tradition and the importance of staying together at table.
Yes. And as you said, the heart of disciples' theology is the importance of the covenant that's established at that table, where Jesus invites any who would come, and that it's not our job to say who gets to be there, but simply to make room for anyone who wishes to come.
Yeah.
And Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell, our founders, didn't agree on everything, but they felt it was the most important witness that we could make as the church, to walk together even when we disagree. And that they didn't want to see fractures and splits within the body, because that just cut away at the validity, really, of the gospel that we preach. And that's who I think we are as disciples, as you say, that the theological diversity is both deep and wide. And being able to stay at the table. I think I've been involved in a lot of moral movements, from the Poor People's Campaign, which is trying to empower poor and low wealth people to get engaged in the political system, to an organization that is a consortium of mainline and evangelical churches called Faiths United to Save Democracy. And the focus of all of that work, and I think what Leah Shade, who talks about preaching in a purple zone, what anybody will tell you is that, first of all, we must ground this morally and theologically, right?
Yeah.
That the biggest challenge we have is people who think, oh, don't talk politics in the church. We're not talking partisan politics.
Right.
But we have to recognize that as the Imago Dei, that we're created in God's image, and everything that God created was good. The Matthew 25 exhortation to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, care for the sick, visit those who are in prison. I would argue that you have to go beyond that and address the systems that allow people to be poor, hungry, and the horrible situation of our criminal justice system that's resulted in mass incarceration. But we have to focus people on understanding in the church that as followers of Jesus Christ, this is our call, our mandate, our mission. Jesus, when he reads from Luke 4:18, says, the Spirit of the Lord, he's reading from Isaiah, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to set at liberty those who are captive, to bind up the brokenhearted, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. Jesus' own mission, and if you watch and pay attention to what Jesus did and whom he hung out with, Jesus was about the inclusion of the poor, the inclusion of people on the margins, justice in society. So that's the perspective that we take. And as human beings who have dignity and worth, part of our society allows us to express that humanity through participating in elections and helping to make the decisions and choices, just as we would vote at our General Assembly.
Right.
We have to vote in the wider elections that govern the societies in which we live. That's how we have the impact. And we do that by thinking about who are the people and what are the policies that we think will further that. Now, you can make the argument that you have the moral majority and the religious right who have for years organized and put a whole lot of money behind that. But then you have to ask, along some of those policies, Are those policies reflecting the limitless love of God? Are they? There are a lot of people, our denomination took a stance against Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
To even say that there are some policies and some approaches
Right.
that actually aren't Christian because they deny the humanity of certain people and that they're actually harmful to the human dignity and flourishing of certain people. So it must, first of all, be a moral argument, and we must frame it morally and theologically. And then we need to practice how we have these conversations, right? We tend not to steer away from them, right? We don't want to have the conversation. I would argue, as I said earlier, we had to build capacity for being honest and learning how to respect people even when we disagree with them. Yelling and screaming.
Right.
I can yell and scream with the best of them. I thank God for the Holy Spirit that has cooled my jets a little bit as I've gotten older. But we have to respect the fact, my home pastor, Dr. T. Garrett Benjamin, they used to have a preschool program called the Respect Academy. And this was the mantra: we do not have to agree, but I must respect you and you must respect me. And that, to me, is what staying at the table really is. And I really do believe that it is the best way to bear witness to the gospel of Jesus Christ. To say that I'm not here to reject you. You're welcome at the table. I may disagree with you to the hilts, but I'm not going to allow our disagreement unless you're causing destruction to life or limb. Your disagreement doesn't give you sanction to destroy me.
Right.
You don't get to do that.
Right.
But if we disagree, let's talk and better understand and figure this out, because the last thing we want is for people outside the church to look at the church and say, oh my God, why would I want to be a part of that Jesus thing? When they can't even hold it together, when they treat each other that way, why would I want to be a part of that? If they're hateful and discriminatory to other people, why would I want to be a part of that? And I think it's all wrapped up in the moral and the moral arguments, the teachings of Jesus, and the witness that we say we want to make that witness. As I say, let's be the church we say we are. We got to do that work, and we need practice. We need to learn. We need to build capacity to have those hard conversations. But we can't walk away from the table, even if we think the other answer is that I don't agree with that, so I'm leaving the table. That's not helpful either.
Yeah, I'm so glad you've highlighted the importance of that, practicing hard conversations, and I'm writing that down. Can't walk away from the table. I know that's been a topic. Go ahead.
I was going to say, a woman I greatly respected who's no longer with us was the first woman from Africa to be the moderator of the World Council of Churches, Dr. Agnes Aboum, Aboum. And I saw this quote after she passed away, and I thought, she's saying exactly what I want to say. So I quote her now all the time. It's okay to disagree. It is not okay to disengage. And that for me is, staying at the table is really the work that we're called to do as followers of Jesus Christ, no matter what tradition. And I'm so proud to be a part of a church that really that kind of defines us, right? That really defines us. But we have to do that. We really have to be the church we say we are, and not be caught up in what's swirling around us, where we think that there's only one way to be Christian. That's being a certain kind of American, or to be a good American. That means you have to be a certain kind of Christian. That's just a lie. It's not true. It's not faithful to the scriptures. It's not faithful to the teachings of Jesus. And so we have to find a way to do the hard work.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing all that. I think that's very helpful. As we think to the future and look ahead, again, my podcast is Future Christian, so we tend to try to do some future thinking here. One of the things that stood out to me from your conversation, or excuse me, your presentation, your message, was about the importance of imagination before implementation. Talk more about that importance.
Yes. That it comes from a quote from an amazing book that's close to probably 50, if not probably 50 years old now, Prophetic Imagination by Walter Brueggemann, who is a Hebrew Bible scholar. Walter Brueggemann has, in past years, come to the General Assembly to preach to
You
disciples.
have the book right here to my right here.
Yeah. And he says in that book that the prophet is engaged in what he calls futuring fantasy, and that our society is equipped to implement anything.
Right.
We can implement anything, but imagine almost nothing.
Yeah.
And that, he talks about the empire, and any institution that's grounded in a certain kind of authority is not interested in you thinking differently about things. Because if you're imagining the artist or somebody who's thinking differently, you can rattle. When we build structures, sometimes we get really comfortable in how things are, because as we grow, we learn how to navigate and manipulate the structures to our own benefit, right, as human beings. And that sometimes creates problems. So the empire doesn't want us thinking differently. And by empire, those are those structures that are intended to privilege only a few people. And so he talks about the prophet needing to create or paint the vision of what the alternate reality would look like. Because if we can at least help people think it could be different, it doesn't have to be this way. And let's imagine together, as I say, who we must be as a new church for a new world. We can get there, but we have to first imagine and be free to think and not be afraid of what happens when we change.
Right.
Not be afraid of what we have to let go in order to change, and not be afraid even of the people who will oppose it, because we will affect their particular power platform, right? And create a culture where we're always thinking about what's next, and we're always imagining where we go from here. One of the things that the disciples did when we created our denomination, in this process we called restructure in 1969, the first two general ministers and presidents regretted they didn't get as far as they wanted, because they had to compromise a lot just to make the first thing happen.
Yeah.
And my hope is, with the changes that we're making with the Covenant Project, with the General Board and General Assembly, that we've got to build in a culture at the church that says we must always be okay with doing things differently. We don't have to do it the way they did in 1969. Years from now, I don't want people to say, oh, that was just a project we did when Terry was GMP. I want us to look back and say, oh, we actually are empowered.
Right.
Our forebears wanted us to understand that we're always able to do something differently.
Yeah.
We're always able to imagine and do church in a way that makes sense for the world we live in today, and not for the world that our grandparents inhabited. And that's, to me, the really important thing. And for those of us who lead, we're not just here to manage things. We have to create that capacity so that people can imagine what might be possible. I talked about that in February of 2020 at General Board, and 3 weeks later we were all in lockdown. So the new world landed in our laps. But the prophet is engaged in futuring fantasy, and that fantasy is not silliness. It's something that doesn't yet exist, and we have to help people see and feel and believe that future is possible. That's the real work of the prophet, because 9 times out of 10, that imagination is intended to dismantle systems that keep people from being able to flourish. The empire doesn't want you to dismantle the systems, but you have to be able to see it, because human beings, with the power of God, we can do anything. I really believe that. The resources will come, but we have to imagine it first and be willing to let go of what is in order to move in that direction.
Something else you said stood out to me. You talked about the past is not coming back. And I've served in older congregations demographically. Many of our congregations in our denomination have been around a long time with older members and demographics. How do you speak to congregants and members who really, for good reason, appreciate the past and what was when great ministry and vitality happened? while also seeking to help them build a new identity in our tradition together.
Absolutely. I'm old enough to know, old enough to get to the point where I'm even a little nostalgic about even the music, right? The gospel music that I listened to as a kid or as a child. Sometimes when I'm listening on the radio, it's like, that's too, it's too contemporary. I want I want the old stuff. We all have that, right? I was a teenager in the late 70s. I listened to 70s on 7 radio because that's the music of my youth, right? That speaks to us. So we all have that.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to remember that what the heart of the church is not our buildings, and it's actually not even our liturgy.
Mm-hmm.
It's not our organizations. It's this community that we create to both worship and serve not only each other, but to serve our communities. So if our communities are changing, in order to be relevant, we have to change. We cannot be so tied to, and this to me is a spiritual problem too, because if we're not spiritually deep and developing, then we see ourselves as just a club that meets at 10:30 on Sunday morning, and we have coffee afterwards. Well, I can find coffee a lot of places.
Yes. Better coffee,
and
probably.
I can even find good music, and I can connect with my friends. I have a 33-year-old son. I have to deal with him and how he's thinking about raising his son in a different way, because he's not interested in raising his son in the same kind of church that he grew up in, actually, because it's a different world, a different adult. We want to pray with our grandson, do all the kinds of things, but that little boy is going to be part of a different kind of spiritual scenario. And it's not about the buildings, churches that have sold their buildings and created other more practical structures. We want beautiful things, yes, and in some cases we can save and repurpose and create new ministries inside of those things. But we have to imagine, to go back to 1980, when we had 100 or 200 people here and we had all the same things going on, denies the reality of how society has changed. And the numbers are even telling us that people don't want the kind of institutional gatherings that they've had. I was at the naval base in Newport, Rhode Island this past weekend. The Naval Chaplaincy School is there, and we have 3 chaplains who were there, one of whom is an instructor. The other is sort of the commanding officer of the chapel. So he's like the pastor of the local chapel. I preached on Pentecost, chapel full of young people, recent college graduates who are in officer candidate school. They're getting ready to start or in the middle of chaplaincy school, choosing to be there on Sunday, fully engaged. Everybody's up singing. They're with me during the sermon. Young people are seeking after God. To say that they don't want anything spiritual is not true.
Yes.
What they're seeking is our constructs and contexts that speak to how they engage in the world. And we wanted that when we were young people. I rubbed up against tradition in my own church as a young person and a young adult. And so young people are doing that. So we can never say that we want it the way it was, because that nothing is ever coming back in that way. And when people say that, I'm like, oh, you're trying to restore your club, and you're more concerned about members and how many butts you have in the seats than you are about lives that are being changed, or even people don't want to join things. I had folks who were very active in all the ministry that my congregation did. These people were in their 70s. They just didn't want to join anything. They gave. They were generous givers. They were there for everything. They just didn't want to join anything. So what? We're not going to let people be active in ministry because they don't want to be a member. These are things that we have to open ourselves up to hear from people why they don't want to belong to these institutions, but also recognize that it's not God who has failed them. And it is not God that they don't want. It's the institutions. It's the human structures that we have created that are failing people. People are seeking. They just don't want what we've created. And they need to create, and we need to move with them to create other ways of being church that matter and are relevant to future generations.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I know Ted Smith and others have some great work on that. I was privileged to have him on recently. Yeah. Last question before we take a break. I want to give you an opportunity. This is a podcast listened to by a diversity of audiences. So give your best, why disciples, rah, rah, go team speech here, if you would.
I think the beautiful thing about disciples is that we do recognize that we are Christians, but we're not the only Christians. That the covenant that Jesus established at the table that welcomes all to the table is one that we must take seriously. And so therefore we allow for a wide range of theological diversities. And we do believe that we are better as witnesses when we can walk together even when we disagree. We don't have a lot of orthodoxy. We're not anti-creedal. Mm-hmm. We just don't have a creed that would be a test as to whether or not you belong.
Yes.
We simply confess that Jesus is the Christ, Son of the living God, proclaim him Lord and Savior of the world. And we can wrestle with interpretation of Scripture, but we're the people that want to stay at the table because we believe that kind of unity is not unanimity, mm-hmm. but it involves and allows more people to be a part of this thing that we call the body of Christ. And we take that very seriously. And we take ourselves to the table as often as we can, most of us every week, to remind ourselves of that covenant that Jesus gives. So you may hear that disciples have communion all the time. It's not just a ritual. It's really a reminder that we really, it's not our table. We want all who desire to be there to come.
All right, I'm fired up. Hopefully our audience is too.
Oh, good.
Let's take a quick break here and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with General Minister and President, Reverend Terri Hord Owens. So thank you so much for your time. I always tell folks these closing questions, you can take these as seriously or not as you'd like to. This is the question actually I'm most excited about because you are, to this point now, the highest denominational official I've talked to and closest to what we might call a pope. So if you were Pope for a day, and you can interpret this however you'd like to, what might you want to do with that day?
It's kind of funny that you say that because many disciples, when they're trying to explain who we are and who I am, they will say, well, she's our Pope.
Yeah.
The GMP is our Pope. But with none of the authority that the Pope has, mm-hmm. We're very much a covenantal church. So if I don't have a certain level of direct operational authority over the whole church, if I did, mm-hmm. we would have some sort of, and I won't call it catechism because I would not want there to be sort of an intentional thing that would be taught. But I would encourage and almost require people to have, some form of spiritual practice and some form of Bible study. Yeah. I really feel that we're so biblically illiterate. And as Christians, that is devastating. I'm not arguing for a dogmatic interpretation of the Bible. Mm-hmm. I just want to equip people to even wrestle with it. We can't talk ecumenically or even on an interfaith basis unless we understand what our text is saying and what Jesus taught, what the Hebrew prophets say, because Jesus refers to them. That's what shaped and grounded him. Without that, we're spiritually just weak as Christians. And so I would want to find some way to insist that there be some form of Bible study and prayer, meditation, some form of spiritual practice that starts with our kids, mm-hmm. right? We send our kids to camp, and that's one of the. And now all cultures are into the outdoor camp, and there are many years when Black kids couldn't come to disciples camp years back, but that notion of spiritual formation happening within camp, that's really important. So we have to find some way to do that spiritual formation that would involve prayer and Bible study. That's one of the most important things that a church can do. And as just simple believers, we're passing along a great tradition, right? Mm-hmm. The stories of Jesus. It's important not to get dogmatic or to hem in anybody's theological imagination, but there is a tradition of the stories of Jesus. There is some, and even as disciples, there's something about us that we want
Right.
that we want to remain after we're gone. So I think that's probably the thing I would do. And I would require people to do conflict resolution.
Yeah, that would be
training.
good. That would be good.
Because I think we did a session with a group called Crucial Conversations about how to have hard conversations with the leaders of our general ministries. And more, I find that my experience in doing some of that in the corporate world, and also as a dean of students who often had to have really hard conversations with people and do it from a, I didn't need to make people feel horrible about giving them bad news or trying to move them to a different way of being or a different way of thinking. But I think we need to learn how to have those hard conversations and deal with conflict in healthy ways. And I think clergy would be and congregational leaders, even lay leaders. That's one of the biggest challenges I see is that people don't know how to manage conflict. We think that, that's the pastor. Or that's, I can't say. And so when we have misconduct or we have problems, nobody wants to put the person in check who's causing the problem. And we don't have healthy ways of doing that. And so we suffer because we don't find a way to root out and resolve conflict.
Well, I am comforted to know that should our autonomy or voting structures change, these are very reasonable resolutions you would implement here. Who is a theologian or historical Christian figure you would want to meet or bring back to life?
Oh my, there's so many. But I think I would really like to meet Howard Thurman. He is a self-described mystic.
Yeah.
He's the person that, Dr. King carried his work with him all the time. And usually it's Lent. He has some good Advent stuff too. But I find that when I read him, he is somebody who spoke from who he was as an individual, as an African American, but also just spoke to that deep inner spiritual need that people have to connect with God. And I would love to learn how his life experience came together in his ministry and in his study. He's just got some profound things. And as a leader, I'd love to be able to write in a way that moves people the way he moves.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I think history will remember how divided this nation was. And sadly, I think history and our descendants will ask, why didn't we do more to counteract some of the injustice and inhumanity that we have seen perpetrated? Why did we stand still?
Yeah.
And not do more to insist that to name the truth and call a thing what it is. And I think the pivot point, we talk about the 1918 Spanish flu.
Right.
People will remember the aftermath of the 2020 pandemic and how it changed all of our lives and how we even think about, airborne respiratory viruses and changed the way we work. It changed and to have been alive during this time, I think is, things really are different. We see work differently. We think about our mental health differently. We think about our physical health differently. And so I think future generations will lament the fact that we didn't do more to address some of the injustice that we have facing us and that we allowed polarization to dominate.
Yeah. Well, I usually ask the final question, what do you hope for the future of Christianity? Let me localize this a little bit. What do you hope for the future of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ?
What I hope is for a more connected church where congregations understand they are, we have congregational polity and you're free to call your own pastor and do all the things, but we are stronger together. And my prayer is that our congregations understand that by being connected, there is space for everyone, and that we can do more together, and that connection will come, I think, from deeper spiritual foundations, and that the church will prioritize and seek to build within itself stronger biblical literacy and more consistent spiritual practice. And I think those things will allow us to be more connected. We're not going to do much good in the world just as little scattered congregations, but when we come together, we still have the freedom to be who we are at home and address the needs at home, but then leverage our power and our resources to really do good around the world, quite honestly. So I pray for a more connected church.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate the conversation and your insights here. Share, if you would, just how can people connect with you if they want to get to know you better, connect with the denomination, all those sorts of things.
Sure. You go to disciples.org. That's our website. And you go to disciples.org/OGMP and you'll get to my office, but you'll also get to all of the 13 general ministries and our 31 regions. If you're looking for a disciples congregation in your area, there's even a little search function that allows you to do that. I'm on all the socials except for TikTok. I'm on Facebook. I have a personal page, Teresa Hord Owens, but my public page is Reverend Terri Hord Owens. I am at T Hord Owens on Instagram. And I'm also on LinkedIn as Teresa Hord Owens, but I'm on Threads as Terri Hord Owens, I think is Terri Hord Owens. And I'm on Twitter, but not on Twitter's kind of gotten a little toxic,
bit.
So I'm not on Twitter.
A
little bit. I've migrated more over to Threads at Terri Hord Owens. So if you search T Hord Owens or Terri Hord Owens, you will find me on most social media.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for your time and conversation. I always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. God's peace with you also.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.